Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work of social justice.
Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And so with that, Aaron, you're up this week. Mm-hmm. What are you bringing to the table today?
I have an article called What Abolitionists Do. So that's what I'm bringing to the table.
Yes.
It is a piece that was actually written in response to someone criticizing abolition as a lofty, unattainable, like ridiculous thing to consider or pursue or like organize around.
Yeah.
And so the critique was framed as if abolitionists just want to tear down prisons tomorrow and not take a measured long-term approach that would give time to build something new to replace it that wouldn't be rooted in punishment. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what the piece is really about.
Yeah.
Is the sort of response to that idea or quote-unquote critique.
Yes.
Of the prison industrial complex abolition. So this piece was written by Mariame Kaba,
yes.
A now well-known organizer who has written and spoken about abolition extensively. We've talked about her before on the show.
Yes.
We read her book, We Do This Till We Free Us. Great person to learn from.
Yes.
And then joining her in the article is Dan Berger, who, at least at the time that this was written, which was 2017, Dan was an associate professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell, and David Stein, a lecturer in African American studies and history at UCLA. And so I really appreciated this article because, as I said just a minute ago, it refuted this whole notion of the article that it was responding to around abolition being impractical.
Yeah.
It ignores the original article, kind of ignores the real on-the-ground organizing that people are doing to help decrease the power of the prison industrial complex. And I think this article does a great job of laying out some of the history of abolitionist movements,
yes.
And the way kind of social change has worked in the past, to some of the ways that current abolitionists are putting in work to get us away from and find new things to replace the prison industrial complex.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's an incredible piece. You know, I'm really glad that you found it, and I think like what you said, I think it definitely achieved this goal of addressing the, like how you said, quote unquote critiques that were out there at the time, and I think to some degree, still exist today about what abolition is and what abolitionists are trying to achieve. And so, one of the things I really appreciated about this piece actually was a quote at the very beginning of the article that I think sort of put all of this plainly, right, and put it in context. It said, and I quote, "Prison abolitionists aren't naive dreamers. They're organizing for more concrete reforms animated by a radical critique of state violence." And I just think that was and is such a powerful statement in truth, right, for so many reasons. I think it's absurd to call abolitionists naive or really sort of, in my opinion, critique the work they are trying to do and the real change they are demanding, because I think the evidence that our systems aren't working at this point is crystal clear, right? I know all of these things are sort of related and connected, but I want to name them, right? We're talking about the prison industrial complex. We're talking about our criminal punishment system. We're talking about law enforcement, public safety, state violence, right? Like, we have countless examples of how these systems aren't effective, right? Mm-hmm. And how they do more harm than good. And they're not helping us address and make positive change to the conditions in our society that truly need repair. And so, again, I think this article really hit the nail on the head in sort of addressing particularly that article that it was responding to, but many of the critiques out there around abolition, right? And I know you agree with that, right?
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why I brought this to the table is like just the way that they addressed those things. And I think that having read Mariame Kaba's work before, I was also attracted to this piece because in that book, I think, which is a collection of essays, she writes out how, this current systems are failing us in different ways. And I think one of the early points that the article makes is that people criticize prison abolition without really understanding what it means, which is why I say, like, quote unquote critiques, because I think that if you critique something without really understanding what it is, it's not really a critique. Then
you have no right to a critique.
Right. It's your misunderstanding.
Yes.
So I know we've talked about this here before, but I think it bears repeating that abolition of the prison industrial complex is really about taking a look at all of the ways, as you said, our current criminal punishment system is failing communities and not producing the justice that it claims to produce.
That's a good point of that too, right? Producing the justice, yes, that it claims to do.
So I think abolitionists are really focused on building the world we all deserve. And I think that means finding ways to provide the basics that everyone needs to thrive in their communities. It's about finding our mutual interests and shifting our thought processes from competition and punishment to more sort of collaborative natures, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we think about punishment. Usually that comes at the hands of the state when we're straying from the rules and regulations and expectations that are set up in our communities that are meant to sort of keep us in boxes and sort of control us in different ways.
Confine us,
And so the authors define abolitionist reforms. So these are things that organizers are doing on the ground that are actual real-life examples of things, progress towards abolition as measures that reduce the power of an oppressive system while illuminating the system's inability to solve the crises that it creates. And so that's what abolitionist reforms are.
Yeah.
And that's what people are working toward in a variety of communities across the United States and across the globe, really.
Yeah. I mean, folks, I don't know if you can tell, but clearly we both agree, like, with this idea and importance and like really the necessity of abolition, right? And so I definitely appreciated their definition of that. And so I'm glad that you shared that here, right? Like, what are we doing to sort of reduce the power, take power away from these oppressive systems that really are not serving us one bit? So that's sort of one piece of this that absolutely stood out for me. I'm glad we shared that. One of the other things that stood out to me in this piece was, that quote that you mentioned, right? Because I think, it just reinforces why it needs to go, right? Like, why the prison industrial complex, why, these systems need to go, right? I think that's really the only way forward. These things and efforts that we can do to reduce the power of these oppressive systems, like I said, that don't serve us, right? That create more problems in our society, that don't keep us safe, right? And so in this piece, they quote the late Rose Braz from Critical Resistance, and they quote her a lot, right? I think in an interview that she had done in a couple of other places. And really, our goal, as she puts it, and I agree, is really to fight for real social change, right? And if we are actually about that and want to do that, then we have to embrace abolition.
Yeah, and I think that there's an argument out there now about sort of considering more reforms to the current system, and I think that I understand that line of thinking because it's less scary. It's more familiar, right? But we've been doing reforms to the way that the system has been working for centuries.
Yep, forever.
And it's still doing what it's doing.
Yep.
In fact, we're making it more perfect, right? We're making it easier to create harm and not justice the more that we reform it.
Right.
Right. Like women's prisons were a reform. And now we have how many millions of women locked up in the United States. So, we did reforms. We've been doing reforms. And so now it's time to think about reforms that create something new.
Yes.
And not reinforce what we have.
Absolutely.
And one of the other things that stood out to me here was this connection to broader historical movements, like the abolition of enslavement in the U.S. and women's suffrage and the labor movement and civil rights.
Yeah.
And so the article says that responding to abolition as like a goal that for organizing that's unlikely to resonate with the public at large isn't how social change happens. Right. So just because the public at large is not on board with something, the public at large wasn't on board with those other things, really.
Ooh,
right.
Yep.
This is a slightly different example, but if you look at the popularity of Martin Luther King before he was murdered, like he was not popular with the larger public.
Yeah.
And now he's a sort of well-regarded hero across most of the world. So, they cite some examples that I just mentioned about, abolition of enslavement and civil rights as well, as sort of concepts or goals, right, that weren't accepted by the public at large.
Absolutely.
They write that most abolitionists, in our experience, would subscribe to Nelson Mandela's adage that it only seems impossible until it's done, which I think rings so true to me, especially when you think about like women's suffrage, you think about civil rights, you think about the abolition of enslavement. It was all that people knew in the country until we didn't know it anymore and had to find something different.
Yep.
And now we messed that up royally. And we're still paying for those, like, Reconstruction falling apart. We're still paying for that today.
Yep.
But, right, it didn't seem possible until it was.
Right.
And so I think we have to continue to experiment and build, which is what we talked about when we read We Do This Till We Free Us. We have to give communities the opportunities to do things like mental health intervention teams that are sent to mental health crisis calls to 911 instead of police, right?
Yeah.
Like we have to do things like that to find ways to shift away from police and prisons being a catch-all for all of the social ills that we have, which is a paraphrase of something they said in the article too.
Right. Absolutely. Like, what are the things that we need that will serve us in those moments? Right.
Yes.
Absolutely. I absolutely appreciated the connections that were made in this piece to those, historical time periods and movements, as you mentioned, like abolishing slavery and the civil rights movement and women's suffrage and even the labor movement. Right. Because I think there's such a clear connection that can be made between the power and persistence and time and energy and need for radical ideas and reforms, right? That it took for the organizers of those sort of fighting in those movements. All that connects to what abolition requires, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think the other related point that's in my mind about this and is that none of this is easy, right? It's really difficult work, and as you said, right, we could at the time of these things we couldn't imagine anything else because it's all we knew. Right. And so it absolutely takes a tremendous amount of fortitude and commitment and imagination, which I know is, Mariame Kaba, she talks a lot about imagination, right? From all of us and certainly from our government and our systems, right? To sort of be able to enact what abolitionists are seeking to do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it too is that the way that government works has to change radically too. So it's not just about what we have now there, but also about major changes there fundamentally.
Yes. Well, that's a whole episode in itself, huh?
Yeah. So another thing that stuck out to me, another line that stuck out to me in this piece was where they said, while one could find quote unquote evangelical zeal among any political movement, it is inaccurate to cast abolitionists as opposed to incremental change. Rather, abolitionists have insisted on reforms that reduce rather than strengthen the scale and scope of policing, imprisonment, and surveillance. I think that's so true, right?
Yeah.
Like that's sort of a theme I've been hitting on as I think back to this article. It makes me think back to a time when I was chatting with somebody, just like I think on Instagram DMs or something. I don't remember where it was. It was a sort of random chat, and we were talking about the conversation somehow came to abolishing the police. And they replied that they didn't want a bunch of laid off angry cops running around communities tomorrow.
Yeah.
Which I was like, well, okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Right.
Because I didn't want to get into it over whatever platform we were talking. I was like, this is a conversation face to face, and we're not face to face. So I don't think that that's what abolitionists are talking about, right? I don't think turning around and firing all the cops today so they can run around and do what, like, cause whatever havoc is in this person's imagination tomorrow is what anyone is really advocating for.
No.
I think part of abolition would, as this quote says, be slowly and incrementally replacing the police with something else so that these folks who do work for departments in the variety of ways that you could work for a law enforcement department would have the ability to find something else to do. It's, like, it's finding ways, as they say, to reduce the scale and scope of policing, imprisonment, and surveillance.
Yes.
It's not about flipping a switch and shutting everything down tomorrow without acknowledging the realities of what that all would mean for us long term.
Yeah. That's a really great story, right? I think because it's a great illustration of, like, real life application of what abolition is and looks like, right? And and this isn't even application yet, but we're talking about it.
It's true,
right? But I appreciate that story, right? And I would even take it a step further, right? I think one of the big tenets of abolition is the reduction of harm in and to our communities, right? And so in this conversation you were having about abolishing the police, or in general, in the conversation around abolishing the police, right? I think part of reducing harm absolutely means that we're not just going to lay off or fire police officers. And as you said, all of the sort of folks who work in all the various arms of law enforcement with, like, the snap of a finger, right? Because that in and of itself would cause real harm. And I think it would be, like an active force against whatever abolitionist reforms we're trying to enact in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's important to sort of note and to really think about, right? Because I think that's part of this conversation that we're having in the context of what abolition is and what it means, right? And that it both of those things have to be true, and it is sort of slow, sustained work, right? And it takes this imagination to think about all of the pieces of that. What does it mean if we abolish the police and policing in this country? Who are all the players involved, and what does that mean for them, right? Like, that takes time and energy, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I don't want to sound dismissive of this sort of thought process or argument against abolition, because that I think that argument is grounded in history, right? Like, we have seen over the course of history in the United States where entire groups of people get laid off and just sort of patted on the back and sorry,
sent on their way.
Good luck out there. Right? And so it's also grounded in that reality and that history that I think a lot of folks have lived.
Yes.
Of, factories shutting down and just saying, yep, sorry, we're moving somewhere else.
Yep.
And so I do understand it. And I think that it's also a part of abolition to think about, like, the impact on people.
Yes.
As well. To not have sort of a backslide or I don't know, whatever might happen from just laying everybody off tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing that stuck out to me in the article is about California.
Right? Yeah.
And how they built 23 new prisons between 1983 and 1999.
Say that one more time. 23
prisons.
Yep.
Between 83 and 99. So that's 16 years.
Yep.
23 prisons. So that's, that's a lot of prisons.
Yes.
It's 1.5 a year, I think, almost.
Yep.
Yeah. If they built 24, it would have been 1.5 every year.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of investment into a system that isn't doing anything except for locking people away.
Yes.
And it makes me wonder, right, if we could speculate a little bit, what what could we do with that money if we could go back in time and spend that same money on programs that would provide people with good jobs and healthcare and access to education? Like, how would our country be different?
Because we're talking millions of dollars.
Probably billions, like
right? For
23 prisons.
Yep.
So, well, and in today's money, definitely billions,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
But, and I know California is just one state, but it's the biggest in terms of population. And so what would the impact be on our country if just California hadn't done that, right? Let alone if other states hadn't done that. I think it's mind-boggling to think about what we could have spent that money on outside of prisons and the industrial complex and the whole system around it. You know, we can't continue to spend at the same rates that we have in the past because it's a vicious cycle where we invest in prisons, right? And then we expect prisons to be filled.
Yep.
Right? Especially if they're private.
Oh, yes.
And if we spend money on police, we expect them to prove their worth. So they find crime to prove that they're doing something for the communities that they're serving.
Right.
So-called serving.
To then arrest those folks and put them in those prisons.
Right. And then, you know, the way that government budgets work is that usually that money is then coming from some other program, right? So we're undercutting the funding of programs that would maybe keep people out of prisons to then put them into, right? So prison becomes this catch-all. And so we can't keep spending money fully in there to solve problems that we're not solving currently with prisons, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's I don't know, nonsense now. Ludicrous.
What an incredible sort of case study, but also like if we could dream a bit about, like you said, just California alone, you take those millions, close to billions of dollars, and spend it and invest it instead, as you said, in like education, right? And sort of all levels of education, right? You know, jobs, healthcare. Oh my goodness, right? Like, what that would have done for us as a society, right? And thinking about sort of the investment in California, but people also grow up in places and leave those places and take ideas and the benefits of those things like education and healthcare with them to other places. So yeah, it's incredible to think about that. And certainly that's just, as you said, one example, right? Just the state of California. And so I think the same questions you ask could be applied to every other state, right? And so what does that mean? What could that have meant for us? And now, since we can't go back in time and we can't eliminate that, right? Like, we got to move forward, right? And so abolition, you know, this provides us with an opportunity.
Yeah. Oh, and the other thing that I just thought about with building new prisons is that it's not like a 1-year expense because you built it and now you got to staff it. Right. And so that's also a continued drain on your state budget.
And you got to maintain it.
So there's right. So it's not just a one-time expense, along with most other government programs. But right, if we're talking about how this doesn't solve problems, then all right, let's shift a little bit and talk about application.
All right.
I'm thinking specifically about how these things play out in our local communities. Right. Like I know I'm just talking about California. We don't live there. But one of the examples of abolitionist work in campaigning is electing just district attorneys who want to fundamentally change the way that the law is applied in their districts, right? So there's a big push, I think, from grassroots organizing movements to think about those local elections,
right?
Whether they're district attorneys or sheriffs or whoever. Right. One of the examples that they gave was Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, who once elected implemented a bunch of fundamental changes in the district. You know, so I think paying attention to what your city or county officials are doing is crucial to thinking about abolition. Defunding of the police is a slogan, and it's a gradual thing, right? Because if you think about it, I think I've said this before, we've been defunding education for decades. So defunding the police, like, you know, it's going to be incremental. It's probably going to be fairly slow, but it's about funding other community needs that would provide for communities more effectively than more cops or more prisons and jails. So these are concepts that are impacting our communities all around us.
All around us. Yeah. I mean, without a doubt, we are on the same page about that, right? I think there's so much application from a piece like this one, right? For one, I think there's some significant personal work and reflection that we can all do to sort of sit with and think about the history of abolition as it's sort of presented in this piece and as it's presented from a lot of these abolitionist scholars and folks doing this work, and the successes of on-the-ground abolitionist work and efforts, right? And so much of those successes were highlighted in this piece, right? You just mentioned Philadelphia, California. The article also referenced Chicago as another example, right? And so I think in my mind, similar to your thinking here, right? Like as folks learn about these successes and the kind of effort it took to make them happen, right? I agree with you and think that a question and potential application of all of this is, what do we need to do in our own backyards? What's happening in your own backyards? What do we need to do? What is happening in your town or your county or your state that is continuing to enable some of these oppressive systems to do the harm that they're doing, right? And what are you and what are we doing to address that, right? What are the organizations that are out here working to address that and that are doing abolitionist work that you can support, right? Who are the candidates, as you mentioned, right, that believe in the power of abolition, have a vision for transformative change, that we can support, right? I think anything we can think of, anytime we can think of application work that exists within our own sphere of influence, if you will, right, or just like in our backyards, in our homes, is certainly a great place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. We make big changes by starting small and starting locally.
Yes.
Yeah. All right,
Good.
let's talk homework.
All right.
I think mine this week is to read some more of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work. She's mentioned a few times in this article and has a book included here called Golden Gulag and an article called The Worrying State of the Anti-Prison Movement. Both of those are, not brand new, but both still really relevant. So I want to dive a little bit more into her work. I will also mention, for comedic effect, there is a Twitter meme account called Ruth Wilson Gilmore Girls, where they take quotes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and put them on screenshots of Gilmore Girls episodes.
My
so
goodness.
also that's funny if you if you are into abolition and the Gilmore Girls, I guess.
Yeah.
But
it would be out of context for me because I've never seen a single episode of Gilmore Girls, but I kind of still want to check it out just because, what? How do you even do that?
I don't know. It's very entertaining.
That's awesome. Well, and I also think that we should probably add those things to our media list and maybe we bring those to the table. That's awesome. Yeah. So that's great. I think for me, this week as homework, I want to learn more about the co-authors of this piece, Dan Berger and David Stein, right? And the work that they're doing, right? Like we obviously know a lot about and have read work by Mariame Kaba, and she is incredible. But this was the first time I've heard of those two folks. As you know, I want to say this again. You mentioned earlier that Dan Berger was a professor of comparative ethnic studies at University of Washington, Bothell, and David Stein was a lecturer in African American Studies and history at UCLA, and so I think if they are writing a piece like this with the great Mariame Kaba, all right, like I definitely want to look into what else they've potentially written about abolition and what other work they've done and in this sort of collective work we're all doing for social justice and collective liberation. So let's see what else they've got going on.
Yeah, I think learning more about those two folks sounds like a great way to keep sort of the learning going on this whole thing.
Very good.
All right. Well, Damien, you are up next time.
Hey.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
It is me. All right. So next week, folks, I'm bringing a film to the table, and I'm hoping that we can continue our conversation about abolition a little bit, if that works for you.
Yeah.
All right. So the film I'm going to bring to the table is called Revisions of Abolition: From Critical Resistance to a New Way of Life. And if you want to check it out with us, you can find it at visionsofabolition.org. Again, that's visionsofabolition.org. And so, full transparency, I have not watched it yet, but from the synopsis, I think this film provides an abolitionist lens to the prison industrial complex and does this through the examination of formerly incarcerated women, which I think is obviously, I don't think we talk enough about women, right? And particularly, Black and brown women, right? And sort of how they are victims of this of this criminal punishment system. And so I sort of I thought that was important to sort of bring up. And I think it talks a lot about critical resistance and the work they're doing. So yeah, I'm looking forward to watching this film and us talking about it next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to watch that. It looks like it's got some really great folks and stories in it that I'm looking forward to hearing. Even as I anticipate they will be enraging and heartbreaking, right? I'm looking forward to discussing and seeing that film.
Absolutely.
All right, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what we're going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, give us a follow over on social media, sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we got going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.